大家好，欢迎收看这期的公子视频，我是公子沈。这期节目跟大家分享最新的一段专访是芝加哥大学著名的国际关系教授米尔斯海默接受美国独立媒体人 Carson 的采访。这段讲话当中，我截取了其中一部分，就是他反思美国的外交政策为什么走入到今天这个地步。一方面在俄乌战争，一方面在中东，是不是美国的错误判断使得自己深陷这两个泥潭当中，没有办法实现真正符合美国国家利益的 Pivot to Asia 重返亚洲战略。那么同时呢，他也提到中国会不会入侵台湾。我们也许不完全同意他的讲法，但是我们可以从他的分析当中获得一些灵感，毕竟他仍然还有很大的影响力，对吧？米尔斯海默也是国际关系学界的重量级人物，所以他们说的话不管我们认可不认可，都必须要听，都必须要了解。我们先一起来看一下美俄之间的关系。今天的美国政坛是不是痴迷于把俄罗斯当作敌人，这样的一个错误的或者过时的认知？
What's going to happen is the Russians are going to end up taking more territory, and the Russians have made it clear that any territory they take, they'll keep. And furthermore, more Ukrainians are going to die the longer the war goes on. So if you believe, like I do, and many people do, that Ukraine is losing, the smart thing to do is cut a deal now and minimize your losses, both in terms of territory and people killed on the battlefield. But you just can't sell that argument. And
why can't you sell that argument?
I think it's probably nationalism in the case of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians view the Russians as an existential threat, and they're willing to fight and die in huge numbers. They're willing to make incredible sacrifices to do everything they can to win this war, and they just won't quit. And the Russians have had a very difficult time conquering the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. Just think about that. Over 3+ years, they have been unable to conquer all of the territory in those 4 oblasts that they've annexed. Please tell me how this army is going to overrun all of Ukraine, then overrun Eastern Europe, and then overrun Western Europe. This is a laughable argument. The idea that you can recreate the Soviet Union, number one, and then two, recreate the Soviet Empire is a pipe dream. So then Putin comes to power, and what happens from about 2000 up until the present is that the West, and here we're talking about the United States as well, of course, becomes increasingly Russophobic and hostile to Putin. And I think it's in large part because Putin stands up to us. I think that we get used to the idea, certainly in the 1990s, that we call the shots. It's the unipolar moment. It's very important to understand that when we expand NATO eastward in the 90s and then in the early 2000s, we're not aiming at containing Russia. What we're interested in doing is taking the pacifier, the American pacifier that sits over Western Europe, and putting it over Eastern Europe and making Europe one giant zone of peace. And the Europeans like that idea. As long as the Americans stay in Europe, as long as NATO remains intact, the pacifier is there. Russians understood that we served as a pacifier. What they didn't want, and they made this very clear, was NATO expansion. February 22nd, 2014. That's when the crisis starts. That's when the Russians take Crimea. This is when you understand, or should understand, the Russians mean business. Do we back off? Do we try to accommodate the Russians in any way? Absolutely not. We plow forward. If the Ukrainians have any hope of rescuing the situation, it's to bring NATO into the fight.
Exactly.
Actually doing the fighting. Both the Biden and Trump administration consider China to be the principal threat to the United States. China is a peer competitor. Russia is not a peer competitor. Russia is not a threat to dominate Europe. Russia is not the Soviet Union. China is a peer competitor. It's a threat to dominate Asia. And what we've been trying to do since 2011, when Hillary Clinton announced it, when she was Secretary of State, is we've been trying to pivot to Asia. But what's happened here is we've got bogged down in Ukraine, and now we're bogged down in the Middle East. And this makes it difficult to fully pivot to Asia. And this is not in the American national interest. But to make matters even worse, what we have done is we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Instead, what we've done with the Ukraine war is we've driven the Russians and the army, the Russians and the Chinese closer together.
So that's so obvious, even to me, a non-specialist, just like it's obvious, just look at a map, that it had to have been obvious to the previous administration, but they did it anyway. So you have to kind of wonder, did they want that?
I think you're underestimating how much strategic sense the American foreign policy establishment has. And as you well remember, at the end of the Cold War, China and the United States were basically allied together against the Soviet Union.
Of course, that was the whole point. Yeah.
Right. So the Soviet Union, the Cold War ends, Soviet Union disappears. And there's no longer any need for us to have a close relationship with China. We don't need them to help contain the Soviet Union. So the question is, what do we do with the Chinese moving forward? And economically, China is a backwards country in the early 1990s. What we do is we adopt a policy of engagement with China. Engagement is explicitly designed to turn China into a very wealthy country. This is a country that has over 4 times the population of the United States. And you're talking about making it very rich. For a realist like me, this is lunacy. You are, in effect, creating a peer competitor. In fact, you may be creating a country that is more powerful than the United States. But the foreign policy establishment in the United States, almost to a person, including hawks like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, said that China can grow economically. We can integrate it into institutions like the World Trade Organization and so forth and so on. And it will become a democracy, and we will all live happily ever after, right? So what we did is that we helped fuel China's phenomenal growth between 1990 and 2017 when it became a great power. You want to remember that when the Cold War ends and then the Soviet Union collapses in December of 1991, we enter the unipolar moment, which by definition means there's one great power on the planet.
Yeah.
That's the United States of America. By 2017, there are 3 great powers on the planet. And one of those 3 great powers is a peer competitor. And we helped create that peer competitor on the foolish belief that if we turned China into a rich country, it would become a liberal democracy, and it would become a friend of the United States, and it would allow us to run international politics the way we did during unipolarity. This is a remarkably catastrophic decision. I remember Zbig was arguing that China can rise peacefully, and I was arguing that China could not rise peacefully and that our policy of engagement was foolish. And as he was speaking and I was sitting on the dais, I was saying to myself, I don't get what's going on here. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's about 10 notches to the right of me on almost all foreign policy issues, shouldn't be making this argument, but he's making this argument.
Yes.
And I'm the one who looks like a super hawk. When at the end of the Cold War, I was more on the dovish side, arguing the Soviets were not 10 feet tall. And of course, Big was always arguing the Soviets were 10 feet tall. So it was really perplexing. And throughout the 90s and throughout the early 2000s, when I argued China could not rise peacefully, I could not get a hearing in the United States. People just didn't take me seriously. They'd say, John's a very smart guy. He's very entertaining. He's amusing, but he's basically crazy when it comes to China. That was the view. Now, of course, I think everybody understands that I was basically right and they were wrong.
那么他讲得很清楚，就是美国的外交政策，特别是北约东扩，实际上产生了一个后果，就是造成了欧洲和俄罗斯之间的分歧矛盾。虽然俄罗斯是侵略一方，是最大的主要责任人，但是从制定外交政策的角度，是否可以避免战争的爆发，有没有更好的方式？当然，今天在讲这个已经晚了，现在已经打起仗来了。那么接下来呢？接下来他的判断就是乌克兰不会退让，因为他没有办法答应 俄罗斯的要求，俄罗斯当然也不可能主动放弃他已经获得的领土。那最终结果是什么？结果就是必须在战场上分个胜负。但是俄罗斯又是一个核大国，所以导致一个结果就是欧洲也不愿意跟俄罗斯正面为敌亲自参战，所以最终的结果就是继续僵持。那么这种继续僵持，虽然对普京来说不是件好事，但是对美国来说也同样不是件好事啊。所以今天美国政府让欧洲出更多的力去对付俄罗斯，其实是应该的，因为这么继续拖下去的话，对美国来说，对美国的国家利益来说，其实是在消耗资源因为他更应该把资源放在印太地区，因为只有中国才是真正的头号的对手和敌人。他说完俄乌战争之后，他又提到了中东中东的问题，就是为什么美国支持以色列？支持以色列本身没有问题，但是如果以色列的某些政策和美国的国家利益发生冲突了，为什么美国还要继续的支持以色列为什么不能通过美国对以色列的影响力来改变以色列的某些政策，让这个以色列的政策更符合美国的利益，而不只是符合以色列政府的利益所以这里边涉及到了在美国的这个以色列的游说团体的力量。
What we have in the United States is a situation where we have this thing called the Israel lobby, which I, of course, have written about with Steve Wald, which goes to great lengths to push the United States to support Israel unconditionally. In other words, no matter what Israel does, we are supposed to support Israel. And the lobby is so effective, it is so powerful, it is so effective that we basically end up supporting Israel unconditionally. What that means, Tucker, is in those cases where Israel's interests are not the same as America's interests, so every president has pushed hard, except for maybe Donald Trump, for a two-state solution in the Middle East. The Israelis have rebuffed us at every turn. And the end result is we now have a greater Israel, and there's no possibility of a two-state solution.
How does it hurt the United States not having a Palestinian state? Why is it in our interest? Why does every president push for that?
Because the United States has a vested interest in having peace in the Middle East. It's not in our interest to have wars in that region. First of all, it forces us to commit military forces. It forces us to fight wars. And that's not in our interest.
讲完中东，我们再回过头来讲印太地区。被问到了中国会不会入侵台湾，而他的答案在我看来还是非常合理的。我们一起来听听他怎么说。
Just give us a sense of 10 years hence, what's America's place in the world?
Well, I think if you look out 10 years, even if you were to look out 20 or 30 years, I think in all likelihood, the system, the international system, will continue to be dominated by three countries, the United States, China, and Russia. And I think the United States and China will remain the two most powerful countries on the planet. And the U.S.-China competition over the next 10 years, and even beyond that, will influence international politics more than any other relationship. One of the two building blocks of military power, the other is wealth. The United States, looking out 20, 30, 40 years, looks like it's in quite good shape, right? Now, what's happened since 2017, and really even before that, is that with the rise of China, the United States lost its position as the unipole, as the clearly dominant power in the international system, and we now have a peer competitor. So when people talk about American decline, they're correct that we have had decline, let's say, since 2017, when China became a great power. It develops enough military capability to put up a serious fight against the most powerful state in the system.
Thank you.
Right. So you want to remember the two main building blocks of military power are wealth and population size. You take that wealth, you take that population size, and that's what allows you to build the powerful military. That affects your position in the balance of power. And remember when I talked about engagement, we made China rich. We made China wealthy. So China always had that huge population. And as a result of engagement during the unipolar moment from roughly, let's say, 1992 to 2017, we helped China get rich. And that wealth coupled with that population side, China becomes a great power, okay? So we are losing relative power over that entire time period. And that's when China then becomes a great power. And we now have a competition where the United States is still more powerful than China overall, but the Chinese are closing the gap. So we're still losing relative power to the Chinese. And I would bet over the next 10 years, we will lose relative power. Not a substantial amount, but some. But still, the United States will probably remain 10 years from now the most powerful state in the system, and the Chinese will be right behind us. The Russians will remain the weakest of those three great powers. But if you project out, 30, 40 years, that's when I think the United States will widen the gap with China, because population-wise, the Chinese population, as a result of the one-child policy, will decline significantly, and we will remain in quite good shape. So I think the long-term future for the United States in terms of raw power looks quite good. In international politics, because there's no higher authority that can protect you if you get into trouble, it's very important to be powerful, right? You can't dial 911 in the international system and have someone come and rescue you. And in a world where another state might be powerful and might attack you, it's very important to be the most powerful state in the system. And the last thing you want to do is be weak. You want to remember the Chinese refer to the period from the late 1840s to the late 1940s as the century of national humiliation.
Yes, it was too.
Yes. And why did they suffer a century of national humiliation? Because they were weak.
Because they were divided.
Right. And remember, we talked earlier in the show about NATO expansion. We talked about why we continued to push and push and push, even though the Russians said it was unacceptable. And why were we going to shove it down their throat? Because we thought they were weak. You never want to be weak. You want to be powerful. We all understand that the United States has been incredibly powerful, and it's used that power in foolish ways, in ways that don't make us happy. My argument is you still want to be powerful just because it's the best way to survive in the international system. It's the way to maximize your security. But hopefully you'll use that power smartly.
Do we wind up in a war with China over Taiwan?
I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely in the foreseeable future. The problem is it's an incredibly difficult military operation for the Chinese because it involves an amphibious assault. They have to go across the Taiwan Strait, which is a large body of water, and amphibious assaults are very difficult. And in all likelihood, the Americans will come to the aid of the Taiwanese. The other thing is the Chinese, unlike the Americans, don't fight wars all the time. The last time China fought a war was in 1979. Just think about that, 1979. In Vietnam. So they went in 79 and got whacked. But they've not fought a war since then. So they don't have a highly trained military that has lots of combat experience that would be capable of launching one of the most difficult military operations imaginable, which is an amphibious assault across the Taiwan Strait into the face of resistance from not only the Taiwanese, but the Americans. So I think that will keep a lid on things for the foreseeable future. I don't think the Chinese will attack. I think that what they'll wait for is the right moment, hope that the world changes in ways that makes it feasible for them to do it.
They're good at waiting.
They're good at waiting. That is, I think that's true. The other point, just very quickly, we do live in a nuclear world, and we have nuclear weapons and they have nuclear weapons, and the incentive for them to avoid a war with the United States and for us to avoid a war with them because of nuclear weapons is very great. So that may really put a damper on things if we ever get into a serious crisis.
其实我可以多补充一句，就是他讲到中国更可能的是去等待。因为非常擅长等待，因为就像他说的啊，我也认同，就是今天的共产党、今天的解放军没有实力可以拿下台湾啊，他没有足够的信心，有这样的实力可以发动一场 跨海的作战它不只是说发射飞弹把台湾岛打个稀巴烂，没有用的啊。还是那句话，他要打的话，就必须要占领台湾，对吧？要实现所谓的统一。那么在这种情况下，他就必须要派出大军，调动大量的资源，对吧？大军压境，而这样的话，就必然招致全球的制裁、围堵，甚至美日的军事介入。所以他没有信心能够真正的成功，反而有可能会导致中共的垮台。我不是说希望战争爆发，而是知道他一定打不赢，而且共产党一定垮台，那么台湾就会真正的获得永久的和平。这是基于我的认知做出的判断啊。但是如果没有这样的认知的那些人，可能就会以为台湾只要投降了，台湾只要下跪了，只要接受一国两制了，就可以避免战争啊，就可以继续的保持现在的生活。这就是天真到有点愚蠢了。唯一阻止共产党统治台湾的、剥夺台湾人自由民主的势力就是美国，就是美国的存在。今天台湾人如果去怀疑美国啊，哎呀，又跟我们取消了防长的会晤，又不让赖清德入境美国的纽约，对吧？是不是美国抛弃台湾啦？啊，如果有这种想法的人，只需要看一看具体的数据，不要看这些表面现象啊，看看具体的美台之间的军事合作，还有其他国家啊，包括美国、英国、澳大利亚、日本，对吧？这些国家的军事演习，以及美军在日本和菲律宾的军事基地的强化和部署，从这里可以看得出来，很明显，美国不会放弃台湾。那些表面的一些事情、临时性的一些安排、暂时的操作都不能说明问题，那些只是被很多人，不管是台湾的蓝白还是中共的统战部门拿出来去吓唬台湾人的，拿出来去误导台湾人的啊，好像以为美国靠不住，所以说我们又打不过中国，还是投降算了。那么如果是这样的话，我认为所谓的蓝白啊，他们在骂民进党是台独，对吧？实际上他们自己才是改变现状的一方。民进党没有改变现状，民进党一直在强调是维护现状，维护现在台湾独立于中华人民共和国的这个事实。而谁是要改变现状呢？反而是蓝白。蓝白自称啊，我们要和平，我们要维持现状，但是他们做法实际上是在帮助共产党去实现促统的战略目标啊。那这样的话，实际上就是在改变台海现状了啊。因为改变台海现状最主要的不是台独，因为台独已经是事实，已经是现状了。真正的改变现状的意思就是两岸统一。这叫改变现状，对吧？这既违背了台湾的主流民意，也违背了全世界各国的立场。所以你有意或者无意的帮助了共产党去统战台湾，去影响台湾，实际上才是真正的在改变现状。但是他们自己呢，却说台独分子是改变现状啊，给别人贴上台独的标签，这难道不是颠倒黑白、倒打一耙吗？那至于米尔斯海默所说的共产党在等，实际上其中一个我认为的等待的原因，就是要等他们入侵台湾或者拿下台湾的成本降到最低的时候才会出手。那什么时候会降到最低呢？就是他们认为台湾会投降，台湾不会跟美国联合起来阻止中国的入侵，只有这个时候他们才会去这么做。比如亲中的势力控制了总统府，控制了立法院，然后这些人拒绝美日势力介入啊，说这是我们中国人自己的事儿，那这个时候就不用再等了。